So hello, welcome. Thank you to everybody for joining this webinar. My name is Moki Makura, and I'm the Executive Director of Africa No Filter, and I'm your moderator for this session. Hello and welcome from a very, very cold Johannesburg, South Africa. Wow, it's great to see so many people on this webinar, and it's also reassuring to know that so many of you also think this conversation is important. So thank you. Thank you for joining, and we really do appreciate your time. We'd love to know who you are, so please tell us. Pop your name and your organization in the chat, and then post any comments in there as we go along. So today's webinar is on how to write about Africa, reframing storytelling and centering equity. So the title of this webinar will probably bring up memories of the late Kenyan writer whose name is Binyavanga Wainaina. So he wrote this satirical essay in 2006 about how to write about Africa, and it went viral at a time when going viral really wasn't a thing. So if you haven't read it, please do. And maybe someone can actually pop it in the chat if somebody knows where it was or where to find it. It was a really clever and humorous story that was grounded in reality. And even though it was 15 years ago, it still really resonates today. And that's because the frames of poverty, of poor leadership, of corruption, conflict, disease, all these frames still exist in stories about Africa today. The problem is they lead to harmful, stereotypical narratives about the continent, that we are broken, that we are dependent, that we lack agency. And these narratives, they actually inform how the world perceives us. They inform development practices, they inform trade policies, investment into Africa. But sadly, they ultimately inform how we as Africans see each other. So this conversation is important because we live in a world that is becoming increasingly concerned about representation, about race, about inequity. And yes, Africa absolutely needs to be part of this conversation. And we want to influence the world's storytelling skills when it comes to Africa and how we are represented. But I'm hoping that no one has joined this webinar today expecting a lecture on how to write about Africa, because that's not what you're going to get. What you are going to get is a conversation that offers practical and fresh perspectives on how to tell stories that truly represent this continent and its people. And by doing just two things, introducing equity, which is, it's really about being fair and impartial and using ethical storytelling techniques. So because we can't immediately change the humanitarian crises, the global health issues, the poverty, all of these are equally part of Africa's story, but what we can change is how we present them. And that's what this session is about. So before I introduce today's panel, just a few notices. So please use the Q&A if you have a question for the panel. Don't use the chat because it just gets buried under lots and lots of comments. So please use the Q&A. And of course, we are live tweeting on social media. We're using the hashtag #TakeBackThePen. So please tag us, Africa No Filter, and we'll drop the hashtags and our handles in the chat. So we're also live streaming on Facebook, so we'll share that link as well. So let's get started. And I'm really proud to say we took the gender equality thing really, really seriously. So this is an all-woman conversation this evening. Meet our panelists. So first panelist is an academic. It's Professor Lebo Moletsani, and she's at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She's written extensively about the ethics of using particular types of storytelling techniques, especially around her work on gender-based violence. Our next panelist is Emily Renshaw, who's the head of content at Comic Relief, which is the UK-based charity that's famous for the Red Nose Day campaign. And over the years, Comic Relief has been strongly criticized for its approach to telling stories about Africa. And Emily has played a key role in reshaping their approach today. So hello, Emily, and welcome. Our next panelist is Dimuna Piri, who's from Zambia. She is our story gatherer. And Dimuna is a land rights activist, and she's a storyteller. And her work is very much in the field, and she helps organizations and herself to gather stories on land issues in rural Zimbabwe for books and for films, both of which she has done. And last but not least is the journalist. It's Heba Ali, who is the CEO of the New Humanitarian, which I'm sure many of you know. It used to be called IRIN. It was UN's funded news agency. Heba has extensive experience covering international humanitarian crises and aid policy, and she's doing amazing work within her own organization to rethink how they cover and tell stories far more ethically. So that's my all-woman panel. And just so you know, behind the scenes, everybody is woman. Everybody's female. So just letting you know, this really is genuinely an all-woman thing today. So let's start with you, Professor Lebo. Hello. So we've been throwing the phrase ethical storytelling around quite a lot. So tell us, as the academic, can you bring to life, what does ethical storytelling actually mean?
Yes, thank you, Moki. So we all know the African proverb, which goes something like, unless the lion begins to tell the story of the hunt, the story will continue to glorify the hunter. And this follows on in terms of research, because that's where I use storytelling. In the principle that people who experience the problem or the issue that I'm investigating are in the best position to tell us about the issue and about how they experience the issue. And in line with that, those of us who are sociologists will remember the work of Anne Oakley with young children. And she often asks the question, what would it really mean to study the world from the standpoint of children, both as knowers and as actors or as change agents? So informed by these 3 points, what is storytelling? Ethical storytelling. For me, it involves stories told by the people who experience the issues, who express how they experience the issue, the way they experience it, and using a medium or media that they are familiar with. Ethical storytelling involves doing least harm, as our ethical boards tell us, least harm to community members or to the community we are working with. That means not exploiting the storytellers by extracting their stories and leaving the scene. I usually say the scene of the crime. It also involves ensuring that the storytelling does not reinforce harmful stereotypes about the social issue itself, for example, HIV, or about the people who are affected by it. Right. On the positive side, ethical storytelling involves a serious consideration of how the process of telling stories and the stories that are told will be of use or benefit to the storytellers. How do we ensure that? So for me, it involves going back to the proverb I started with the lion actually telling their own story rather than the hunter. The hunter.
That used to be my email signature for a very long time, until lions learn to write, hunters will tell their stories for them. But thanks for that. I love what you're saying about extracting stories and leaving the scene of the crime. Talking of which, Emily, I'm coming to you. Comic Relief, you've had a lot of backlash in the past. So tell us a little bit about what that backlash was about, but more importantly, how you has sort of changed the approach to storytelling at the organization.
Sure. So, I mean, I'm sure lots of you know Comic Relief, but if you don't, we have a big fundraising campaign every year in March in the UK called Red Nose Day, which is kind of, everywhere during that month. And it culminates in a big program on the BBC, Big Night of TV, which combines kind of entertainment and comedy content with storytelling about the work that Comic Relief funds around the world. And historically, most of those films were introduced or presented by celebrities who we would take from the UK to visit work that we were funding, and they would kind of respond to what they found. And so obviously that has become unacceptable in this current day and age, and we face lots of criticism for doing that. And so a couple of years ago we decided to stop doing that, and to really focus on sort of refreshing and modernizing our storytelling and centering contributors in the heart of their own stories. That was our commitment. And really it's such an interesting time for us in terms of storytelling, these conversations that we're having about representation, and centering people in their own stories, and how we demonstrate agency and amplify voices are such interesting conversations to be having. And the pandemic over the last 18 months actually helped us accelerate what we were already doing, because we weren't able to send our own production teams abroad anymore. So it kind of forced our hand, and that's been a really interesting, creative and kind of just process driven exercise to see where we can get to. And we've learned a lot over the last year from doing that. And where we're at, I mean, we do storytelling all year round, but obviously our focus is around Red Nose Day. And what we're doing at the moment is just sort of scoping and meeting and developing relationships with production partners in the countries where Comic Relief funds work, both across Africa and in other countries, to find those really brilliant people who we can partner with on creating content. And preferably people who also have some understanding of what it means to make content for an international audience, because ultimately we're creating content for quite often a BBC One primetime, quite a mainstream audience. So having some understanding of what will resonate for that audience is really key, but also working with people who really understand the local context as well and can help us navigate that.
Right. So I want to say thank you actually for the changes and the shifts you have made. I think, the big one that everyone did pick up on was the fact that you don't send celebrities anymore. Thanks for doing that. But let's come to you now, Dimuna, because you're a researcher. You're someone who's worked on the ground in the field for organizations who want to use storytelling as part of their communication. So tell me some of the examples of the very worst, or maybe one of each, the worst and the best kind of storytelling practices you have seen in the work you do.
Okay, so I'll just jump into it. Some of the, I think, examples of unethical storytelling that I have experienced, and I'm going to talk specifically on land-related work that I've been doing, and jumping straight into it. For instance, in some of the communities that I have worked in concerning land rights, and these communities have mainly been displaced because of large-scale land-based investments. One aspect that has been, that was noted during the research work was, for instance, the conflicts that get to exist amongst the community members, but also the community members also with the investor company that goes into the area, and this I'm referring to a mining company, and also between the community members as well as the royal establishment or traditional leadership, and just generally with probably even other NGOs. And we saw that sometimes these conflicts can actually disturb certain communication that actually gets to go out there. So most of the community members sometimes tend to have a certain view or their own perceptions or perspective as regards what they're experiencing. And we see an investor company, what I saw was the investor company was giving information or a projection based on what they understand or how they perceive the issues to be. And also NGOs sometimes coming into the area, they collect information mainly to publish or raise awareness or some form of advocacy based on their perspective. And they're talking about this community being vulnerable most of the time. I think we put them in that sort of class where they're vulnerable and we're showing pity that they don't have probably bargaining power, but they can actually do some of these things. But sometimes we do that because we want funding. So I think that's an example of an ethical way, probably of an example of an ethical way of storytelling. We don't tell the story from the perspective of the community, but from our own perspective most of the times to further our own agendas. And that is a clear, I think, situation that I can cite in that regard. Then also in terms of when we are conducting our research, sometimes we're taking pictures without even asking for consent. These community members, and we are taking pictures, we're taking videos, you know, to come up with some form of testimonials in that sense. And what we tried to do with the research that I was working on was, of course, we were taking information from these community members and packaging it into a documentary. And the aim was to mainly ensure that the voice or the message is actually spoken out by the actual community people, as compared to us always being in the forefront to further that kind of conversation. And we made sure that we aired it on national TV, even all the time when we get to have partnership meetings with the government, with other investor companies. We did that, and it's also there on YouTube. So at least the message is out there from the actual people affected.
Yeah, with their consent, I hope. But Heba, let me come to you as a journalist, because storytelling is in your DNA. It is what you do. So, you know, as a consumer of media, I see stories in global outlets of images of nameless Africans in situations where they're clearly not treated with quite the same level of respect as sometimes their Western counterparts. So they'll show faces of, you know, of victims, and, you know, in a way that they don't often do in sort of developed markets. So tell me, how guilty is the media of unethical storytelling and portraying Africa as broken?
Well, I think there's a whole range out there, and there are certainly examples like the one you cited. There are examples of real parachute journalism where journalists will parade into a context that they really don't understand and represent it in ways that are dangerous and I think damaging. And I saw that, for instance, in Sudan, where I worked for some time, where the conflict in Darfur, which was largely a competition over resources, was really presented as predominantly a racial and ethnic conflict. So that kind of narrative of the savages in Africa who are killing each other, which only furthers a perception that they're very different than us. There are certainly editors who drive decisions from New York or from Washington, far from the realities on the ground. And I think there has often been one of two narratives about Africa, either death and destruction, or the opposite, right? The simplistic story of that one village that has, I don't know, made new hygiene pads for women, and then very little in between. So the challenge for us as a news organization is that we only cover the bad stuff that you listed at the beginning. Our beat is wars, disasters, refugees, epidemics. And so we have an even greater challenge, I think, in saying, how do we do that in a way that doesn't fall into the same traps that we've been talking about? So we have always tried to be a bit different in that regard. We're on a journey ourselves, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what we're thinking about for the future, but we see our journalism and have always seen our journalism as in service of people who are affected by crises. And that then shapes everything about how you go about producing your journalism. We start from the experience of the person who's affected and try to center them in our work. And maybe just a few examples of what that looks like in practice. So story selection. To what extent are your stories actually informed by the communities that you're reporting on in terms of what you choose to cover? So if we look back at 2018, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ebola had broken out and the whole world was terrified by Ebola. And everyone was suddenly very interested in DRC and in reporting on DRC. But when we spoke to the actual communities on the ground, what they cared about was measles, cholera, violence, all these other things that had been destroying their communities for a long time and that the international community was simply ignoring. So, you know, that shaped our coverage. Actually, I'll drop an example into the chat of how we tried to then incorporate that into our reporting. That's one example. I think there are many ways in which we've been trying to have more of a solutions orientation to our work to counter against that kind of death and destruction narrative. So we've been looking at, for instance, we have a series called Beyond the Bang Bang that looks at the front lines of peace. And what does it look like when in Nigeria or in Cameroon, you have grassroots communities really trying to build peace together, and to show that there are also efforts to go in the other direction. We're very careful with the language we use, whether it's empowering or victimizing, and whether it ignores some of the colonial histories that may lead Africa to be in the difficult situation that it sometimes is. So there's a whole range of ways in which we're trying to do things differently, and I'm happy to talk in more detail about any of that.
Yeah, so I'm going to come to that, and actually going to come back to you right now, but I want us to take a quick poll first, and it's really just to find out a little bit about who is in the audience. So we're going to launch the poll now, and I'm going to come back and give you the results. So just quickly sort of fill in the questions. And while we're doing that, Heba, maybe you can just talk a little bit about some of the things that you have done, because I think you're doing something that's very brave, something that probably has financial implications and just implications to the whole sort of process of news gathering with the work that you're doing at the humanitarian. So give us an example of one of the changes that you've made, and then I'll come back and I'll give the results.
I mean, I think one of the things we're really trying to center our process around is how is our journalism of service to these communities? So rather than what's a good story that's going to be really sexy for an international audience, what's a story that is actually going to improve the lives of people who are affected by crises? So to give you an example, we exposed a massive scale of sexual abuse and exploitation by aid workers in, as it happens, again, DRC during the response to the Ebola crisis. So the World Health Organization had a number of allegations against it of its staff, or people purporting to be its staff, asking for sex in exchange for jobs. And the story went out, it made headlines around the world. The World Health Organization launched an independent commission to try to look into it. And then we were getting pressure to hand over the names of these women to the investigators. And what we did was go back to each of the 51 women we had interviewed one by one. Actually, we're still in the process of doing it because it's taken so much time, to say, here's what this commission is about. Here is what they intend to do. Here's who it's made up of. And you make an informed decision of whether you want to speak to these investigators or not. And so to really give back the agency to them in determining whether they think it's a credible investigation and whether they'd like to move forward, rather than either saying no to the investigators, we don't have time, or yes, here are the names of women who had spoken to us in confidence. So I think that was an example that took a lot of time and resources from us to say, we're going to go beyond just reporting the story and actually see how can we support the women who we reported on. We've linked them up with lawyers who have expressed interest in defending them in court and so on. So just, I think that's one key, and it's mentioned in your handbook about providing support to the communities. Report on that's one example from our recent history.
Great, thanks, Heba. So I'm going to give the results of the poll. So the first question, we asked what sector do people work in? So it seems that most people, 38% of this group, is from the development sector, and you are communicators, so you're very involved in the storytelling process. 18% of you are from the development world as well, but on the program side. Then 17% are actual content creators. So these are people who are actually doing and creating stories. Then we've got 10% of you who are media or journalists, and 8% academia. And then there's 10% who are other, I don't know what other is. On our second question, so what is your role in the storytelling value chain? It seems most of the people on this call seem to be in the sort of writer filmmaker role. So that's 30%. And the next big thing is your commission of content. So you are commissioning content of some sort. The next lot is 70% of you are researchers. So you're probably helping in that whole chain. And then the next lot is 8% of you are funders. And then 6% are fixers on the ground. So that's an idea of who's in the room. And the third question is, how do you rate your or your organization's storytelling in Africa when it comes to ethical storytelling? And actually, we're not doing badly at all. Most people, 60%, said that their organization or their storytelling was not bad. And then 21% said it was poor. 18% said they rated it very, very highly. And we put this last category in as a bit of a joke, like terrible. And that's why I'm on this call. So 2% of you think your storytelling or your organization's storytelling in Africa is not that great. Thank you. Thank you very much for those of you who did fill out the poll. We're going to do another one at some point in the conversation. But Lego, I'm coming back to you now, because you are in the field, and you know, it's all very well saying that, you know, whose story is it, and we've got to let people tell the story, but what about language issues? And what about when you go in and you want to tell a story of a program that you're doing, but actually people want to talk about something else? How do you draw that line? And I know you've got an example, you know, a gender-based violence example that you told me about earlier. Do you want to share that?
Yes, there's a lot of balancing that one has to do in the field. The first of which you've already identified, which is the language of the telling. The second is the assumptions and the agenda that I go into the field with. So in this particular case, I went into this community to investigate girls and young women's experiences of violence, particularly sexual violence. And they listened to me, but on the second day, they said, actually, ma'am, no, that's not what we want to talk about. What we really want to talk about is forced and early marriage in our community and how it impacts on our prospects for education and future jobs. And so we listened, and that's what we focused on. And we gathered the stories, and that brings me to the third area of balancing. It's not to say that ethical storytelling ignores the bad things that happens. But for me, it's what do we do then after we've listened to the stories of bad things happening? How do we use those stories to imagine alternatives? So together with the girls and young women, we imagined, or they imagined, what they would like to see. And they actually identified who's responsible for doing that. So we took their stories to the traditional authority in the area, who at first didn't listen, but with the evidence that we had, they had to listen. To cut a long story short, using those stories of bad things happening to young girls and women in the area, we developed together with the girls, the traditional authority and the community, a reporting and response protocol to prevent and address early and forced marriage in the community, which was signed early in 2020.
Wow. So that's an example of real impact from storytelling. Great. So Emily, I'm coming to you now. And yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about the importance of audience, because the reason why you do what you do is ultimately to raise funds. So, you know, when you used to send celebrities, it was because you got more attention. So when you commission stories, and when you think about the kind of stories and how you tell them and who tells, how do you put the demands of audience into your storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing challenge. We do lots of audience research into what we think UK audiences respond well to and what people give to. But I was just reflecting when preparing for this session on the fact that there's not a huge amount of research and evidence. There's more now than there was, but into whether people give to positive and hopeful stories as much as they give to sad and negative stories. And I think we certainly need more of that in terms of our own audiences. And, you know, this Red Nose Day, for example, we did do more of our stories were positive, showing positive outcomes for people. And audience responses, the sort of qualitative audience responses, were that it didn't feel as much of a sort of emotional roller coaster as they normally expect from us. And that's really interesting. And it's one thing that we've been thinking about when we're looking at stories for the next campaign is how do we make sure there's a sort of strength of emotional response to the films, but that you're responding to other things, other emotions, you know, like joy and empathy and success, or maybe we make people angry instead of sad, I don't know, but looking at whether those other emotional responses can be as powerful in terms of fundraising as historically sort of responding to very negative stories was.
Right. And just one quick question for me on that. Did you feel there was a bit of a dip when you took the celebrity thing out? Do you feel, you know, people pledging money was less, or people's interest or paying attention to storytelling was less because you took the celebrity thing out?
There's so many other, I mean, there's no doubt that people still do like to see celebrities connecting them to the issues, and we haven't completely lost that from our programming. You know, we still have celebrity presenters on the night. We still have people talking in an impassioned way about the work that the organization does, but it's just not at the expense of drowning out the voices of the people that we are working with, whether that's our funded partners or whether that's contributors who are using those services. So I think that's the real shift, and it's working. I mean, in terms of income, it's hard to sort of completely isolate the individual stories and see what their impact on income is. But you know, the response to our last Red Nose Day, and also to we did a campaign just at the start of lockdown in the UK, at the start of the sort of height of the pandemic in the UK. And that feeling of communities coming together on a single issue was really, really powerful. And I think that's the other thing that this pandemic has given us, even though each country and each individual's experience of what's been happening is very, very different. It is a sort of unifying force, and I think it does help in terms of empathy and understanding as an international community.
Great, thanks. I think, yeah, COVID is responsible for a lot of things, some of it good, most of it not so great. So Dimuna, I'm going to come to you now, because I just want to talk a little bit about one of the big areas about ethical storytelling, which is spending time in the community and really understanding what the issues are and building relationships, building trust. Now, you are in the field, like, how long does that take realistically? You know, particularly if they are foreign organizations wanting to come in, you know, how long does it take? A week, 2 weeks, 2 days, three days? Give us an idea of you know, how you do it.
Okay. So with the research work, I think, and we are talking about ethics, honestly speaking, sometimes in my own experience, a very recent experience in terms of research, it actually took long, because the community that I was going into to gather information, conduct focus group discussions, as well as have administer one-to-one surveys, like I mentioned earlier, there were conflicts within that specific community, and people were constantly at loggerheads concerning certain specific issues around their displacement, around their resettlement and compensation. And there was need to actually get permission from the royal establishment or the traditional authorities in order for you to go into that community. And with the specific experience I had, it actually took longer. I thought it was one of those where you can go and get permission, pay a courtesy call, and sometimes that can happen within a day, it can happen within a week. But in my experience, it happened in 3 months before we could actually get the actual permission to go in that community and conduct that work. And we couldn't do it without them giving us a few 2 or 3 people assigned to us who are locals, so that we don't get attacked. There were some members from another development organization that went into the area without getting permission, and they ended up being attacked by the community members because of the contentious issues within that community. So sometimes I think it's hard to predict, depending on the royal, probably traditional authorities you are working with. And sometimes if it's permission that has to be gotten from the government with all the bureaucratic procedures and processes, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to predict the time frame. So that was my experience. So for me, it took 3 months, and that was the most, yeah.
Wow, that's Heather, tell me, as a journalist, you don't have 3 months to file a story. So what happens? I mean, when you send your journalists in, I mean, the reality is that proper ethical storytelling takes time. How do you address that, this fast news cycle?
Yeah, I think it's a lesson we're learning, that to really work according to your values, you are going to have to slow down. And that might mean you produce less than other newsrooms, but those stories you'll be able to stand by. We don't do very much breaking news, in part for this reason. We try to treat our stories with the nuance that we feel they deserve, and that often means spending months putting a story together in order to get that just right and understand the dynamics in the community and represent that accordingly. We recently published actually an article about peace talks that were happening with jihadist groups in Burkina Faso, and that was the result of 2 years of relationship building with community leaders, cultivating contacts, etc. Making sure that we really understood who was who, because that's quite sensitive stuff that you can easily get wrong. So even for journalists, I think we do need to invest that time. And in order for people in a really busy newsroom to understand that it's worth it, I think we really do, as media leaders, need to communicate that this is a priority and that it does trump being first to the story, because we'd rather write a good ethical story than one that gets out quickly and that ultimately isn't doing a service to the people that we're meant to be serving. So it's a challenge, but I think we've been talking a lot internally about what matters most to us, and if this is a priority, then that necessarily has an impact on how quickly you can produce your journalism. And I think audiences are prepared for that and would prefer that.
Right. No, I really like what you say when you say work according to your values, which means if your values are to do ethical storytelling and do it right, then you need to kind of slow down. So I think that's great. I'm going to throw one question out and anybody can answer this. In fact, I'd like everybody to just have a go and just give us some thoughts, and then I'm going to open up to questions. So I'd love you to tell this audience what sort of factors or what things do they need to do to embed storytelling, ethical storytelling, to their storytelling, so that they know one or two things that they have to think about quite clearly that they need to implement. So anybody first, and then I'd love everybody to just give one or two things that they would strongly recommend. Who wants to go?
I'm happy to jump in. I think it's been mentioned already, but being very conscious of language would be an easy place to start. Is the language that you're using empowering or victimizing? And to what extent do the words you use reinforce power imbalances? To what extent does the information that we leave out ignore certain colonial histories? So, we often use terms like the poorest country in Africa as a way of quickly explaining to people, giving them a reference, but we don't explain why it's the poorest country in Africa, and that's the history of years and decades of colonialism and exploitation by the West. So I think even small phrases like that can make a big difference. And often it is really granular stuff. We write about people who are in need and who are suffering, and it's really easy as a result to paint them as passive victims of something that is happening to them. And with really small wording changes, you can flip that. So for instance, we wrote, again, from Burkina Faso, a piece recently where we were talking about women who had fled. And instead of saying they fled their homes, just a small change in saying they managed to leave or they were able to escape, to say that they actually had that agency, that these were not people who were just waiting for someone to help them, but they took action to help themselves. It's really small wording choices that can start to make a step in the right direction. So that's one piece.
It's like avoiding saying war torn in front of certain countries. It's kind of lazy. Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
I can jump in. Yeah, so for me, I think what I would like to mention is I think the aspect based on experience in the field, depending on the community or the kind of your targeted audience. And most of the times, I think we don't take into consideration, even as researchers, in terms of gathering data or gathering information at the point when we are having focus group discussions with community members, because sometimes you find that when you go to a specific community, because of the cultural practices, the social issues within that community, most of the times you're conducting a focus group discussion and it's the men who are speaking most of the time. So at what point do we get to accommodate the voices of the women as well? So as a researcher or as a story gatherer, it's very important that you balance and try to come up with probably creative ways of engaging the women as well to speak in such kind of discussions. And sometimes you find that the women are seated on one side, the men are seated on the other side. So how do you also maneuver and make sure that you are actually, making that participation in terms of the information you're getting to be a little bit more consolidated? That's an aspect I would like to talk about, but also just generally as well on the content of the research. It's important, of course, to keep in mind that it has to be framed in line with the social and cultural issues that are happening specifically in that community. And I like what Professor talked about, where she went into a specific, she was talking to these girls about a certain topic that she wanted to, gather information on, but they instead decided to told her to talk about some of the issues that that are affecting them. And I think that kind of consideration sometimes and flexibility is very important, to pay attention to what our targeted audiences are experiencing and what is it that they want to communicate.
Great,
I also just wanted, I'll be quick. I just also wanted, in addition to what my colleagues have said, to emphasize the issue of whose language are the people telling the stories, the community members telling the story on. And as researchers, it's very convenient for me if they could tell the story in English, because it means it will be easy for me to translate it into an academic paper. But am I doing them a disservice by having them communicate in a language that they don't have complete facility in? If you look at South African news agencies, it seems to me that they usually go to the person who is most or least capable of communicating in English, and they parade around saying that they have collected local stories. So that kind of language, the language of communicating within the setting.
I mean, it's an excellent point you make. And I know from my perspective, I've been in a situation where we did do something, but then the person who translated this person's commentary for us, everybody was challenging the translation. So you also have to be careful, because they said, no, you've missed the nuance, you've missed the point. And then it was a big thing. And everyone was like, oh, I wish we'd done it in English. But, you're absolutely right. It takes more work. And Emily, that's something that I know you as an organization have been doing. So what are the difficulties? What are the things that have been really difficult for you to do, but you persevered because you're doing the right thing?
I think, I have to say, by the way, I think the guidelines that you've put together are really, really excellent. And the questions that it asks you to ask yourself through the process are really, really brilliant, because that is the key for me, is just continually questioning yourself throughout the creative process. Am I bringing in the right people into, I'm a white woman living in London. I'm not the right person to be telling stories of, a single mum living in Eastern Kenya. So who can I bring into the production process who can help me understand that local context, and who is the right person to help that person tell their story? And that might not necessarily be somebody from that local community. It might be that it's helpful to have an outsider's perspective in some instances. So it's really kind of questioning who you put together in the creative team. And we've been experimenting with some of that and doing some testing with that, like with not in terms of our work in Africa, but we've got a whole program of grants called Across Borders, which is working with refugees and safe and secure routes. And we're doing some photography projects as part of that work, and we've brought on board the photographer is a refugee himself, the producer is a refugee himself. So just bringing in people with lived experience of the issue into those creative teams to try and just improve that representation, make sure we're getting language right, make sure we're being as inclusive as possible in our process. I think that's a really important thing.
And it's just also super difficult. I might just jump in, Moki, because we've been asking ourselves really difficult questions, like, does this mean the end of the international correspondent? Should you never be sending someone from outside of the continent to cover the continent? And it felt wrong to say that the answer is yes, it should only be produced by local journalists, but it should certainly be predominantly produced by local journalists. And then there is value, I think, at times, as Emily said, in having an outside perspective, but getting that balance right, especially for a news industry that has been built for years and years on the kind of dream of the foreign correspondent who's traveling around the world to share a window into or perspective into someone else's world. It entails a lot of really difficult conversations.
Yeah, it's a good point. Could this mean the end of the international correspondent? I don't know. So we're going to have a quick poll now before we go to questions. So Nadia, if you can throw up the questions this time. So please quickly answer them. And it's really a bit more about just, some of the things that you do need to do. I just want to understand what level the audience is. So I'll give you a few minutes. And while we're doing that, I'm going to ask a question. And this question it's from an anonymous person. So, and it's to anybody, and I'll figure out whoever wants to take it. It says, what are panelists' thoughts about what is often described in storytelling as a tension between bearing witness, e.g. violence, hunger, context, and making sure storytelling is ethical and not reinforcing harmful stereotypes? So what's the tension? It's pretty much what we've been talking about. There is a tension. So I really want to sort of address this. No?
Well, I'm not sure that there is a tension. I think if you bear witness properly, it should come out as ethical storytelling. I think bearing witness means really understanding the realities that people and communities are experiencing and telling them truthfully and with nuance and in a way that is representative. So I'm not sure that a tension is inevitable.
Okay. All right, here's a good one. I think this comes from Rashida Namulondo. And her question is, how do you, and Emily, I think this might be for you, how do we balance telling the story in truth, or as the interviewers mentioned, versus creativity? So for example, if you're reporting or making a documentary, it's all about being true to the story versus if you were making a piece of theatre to still communicate the same story, but differently. I think what she's trying to say here is that, where do you sort of draw the line? Because you do want to make compelling content, right? So is it, do you stay true to the story, or do you sort of veer away? And I think, Emily, you've got an example of where you have used a local filmmaker. I don't know whether that example would actually answer this question, if you can tell us what that experience was like.
No, I mean, you stay true to the story. I mean, are you thinking of the example I talked about in terms of using a male crew?
Well, there's that as well, but there's a Kenyan, you had a Kenyan storyteller do a story for you, and I think what came back wasn't right. But anyway, maybe just
yeah, I mean, I suppose the tension that we've found is not being too prescriptive about what we're looking for, and really looking at how we co-create with production partners that we're working with who are based in communities where the work is happening. And sometimes what we have had experiences where we've commissioned a production partner to make something with us, and what's come back feels like what they thought we wanted based on what we've historically done as an organization, because those sort of tropes of appeal films are so familiar to people that I think it's quite easy to fall into the habit of what you expect to see in those films, and trying to break out of that and do something which feels more modern really, and more representative of that community can be quite challenging for people, I think.
Right. Okay. Cool. So have we got the results to the poll yet? Okay. Okay, they've just come up. So the first question was, do you or your organization deliberately practice ethical storytelling? And 80%, wow, 80% of people said yes, they do, which is fantastic. 9% said no, they don't. So please download that handbook and use it, and you will be. And then 12% said they don't know. But hopefully by the end of that 12% will now know, because we actually know what ethical storytelling is. So hopefully you'll hop into that 80% bracket. Second question is, which of these ethical storytelling practices do you or your organization currently incorporate into your storytelling approach? And let's look down. I think it's all come up pretty average. We take time to get to know our interviewees. We use local creatives. We co-create the stories, probably the least one. They don't co-create the story. We use translators, yes. We get signed consent forms beforehand. This one, we share the draft version of the story with the community before we publish it. Yeah, I mean, that's something that can be challenging to do, but it seems very few people do it. And very few people have undertaken courses in ethics or counseling training, which is sometimes what you need to do. The last question is, what do you or your organization need to improve your storytelling about Africa? And the top answer was they need more awareness of why it's important, which is great, which is internal. So things like this, webinars like this, should hopefully let people know that it is important to incorporate these practices in. Next thing was people need more money, because yes, it does cost more money, and I'm sure Emily and possibly Heather, you can attest to that. It also needs more time to work on the project. So deadlines and proper project planning are probably skills that you need. And very few people said buy-in at senior level. So it's great to know that most people are on the right path. So I'm going to come and take another question. Thank you guys for filling in that. And by the way, if anybody's sort of looked at the sort of chat, there's a lot of kind of resources and people have been posting links and things in there. So it's really great. You know, we'll probably collect them all and we'll send them out in a newsletter. So it's really helpful. Thank you. So I'm going to take this question from Ruth McLean Dawson. She's asked a couple, but she said, what are some ideas when the commissioner of work only really wants photos and will use those to tell a story that reflects the commissioner, the person who commissioned the content? So I guess her question is that, you know, you can tell a longer story when you have other things, but with pictures, you can tell, in a way, tell whatever story you want. What happens then? I mean, Heather, as a journalist, you know, and you commission stories that probably maybe only use pictures. How would you address this?
I think the same rules apply to a large extent. A picture can show someone in a victimized way, and it can show someone in an empowered way. A picture can show someone in a dignified or an undignified way. So I think if that's all you have to go by, it becomes even more important that story selection is careful. We've seen a lot of examples where it hasn't been. There was a big debate recently of the New York Times showing the victims of some attacks in Kenya in a way that they probably would have never done had it been Americans. And yet it was acceptable because, you know, Kenyans aren't a huge part of their audience and they didn't really worry about what they might think. So I think that's starting to change, where there's a real understanding now that not only do the photos really matter, but also that we're talking about global audiences, and the audiences that you are photographing are also going to be seeing these photographs, and what are they going to think and feel when they see themselves represented in that way.
Right.
A bit of attention, but again, an example from our recent coverage in a story where we were talking about women who were really afraid and in danger, and instead of focusing on that, in fact, we had found a group of women who were kind of fighting back and speaking out against that situation that they were in. And if your photo can kind of reflect that, the empowerment and the agency that they have rather than the victimization, I think you can go a long way.
Great, thank you, Heba. So I've got this question, and Prof, I think I'm going to get you to answer it. It's from Nyasa Chibi, and she asks, how do you separate ethics from opinion when you look at ethical storytelling, especially now when opinion seems to determine what is ethical? That seems quite an academic question.
And quite difficult. This week we've been having workshops training researchers who are going to go into the field, and that tends to be a very contentious issue in terms of well, where do my values as a researcher come in? Do I just keep quiet even when I hear something wrong from the community? And the answer to that is to keep your eye on the prize. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
That what you want to get out of the community stories told from their perspective. You can have your opinion, but please keep it to yourself. And maybe when you are writing your academic papers, then you can have it. But in terms of community storytelling, it is their story. It is not your story. So I would say ethics trumps opinion.
Fantastic.
I'm not sure
Exactly
that
what I expected you to say. Dibuna, I think this question is perfect for you. And it comes from Edith Kimani. And she says, it costs money to tell stories. We know that. And sometimes the protagonists have financial expectations from the storytellers. Is this unethical? If not, how do we guarantee the accounts given after money exchanges hands is accurate? I mean, how do you handle it in the field? Do you pay the people that you work with?
Ish, I think that's also another very difficult one. In the communities that we've worked in, especially with the development organizations, for some time, I think communities have always believed that if information has to be gotten from them, you need to give them something. So most of the times, I think the practice has been in these communities to give them some form of a transport refund. And I think that has been happening over time and has been practiced by quite a number of different institutions as well as they go into these communities. And there are also communities that are over-researched or over-engaged. So almost every development organization is working in that particular community, and there are definitely I think practices in terms of giving money that have actually been going on. And if you go there and you want to gather information from there without giving them something, most of the times you find you get nothing, or even the participation is actually not as good as you would anticipate it to be. So I think it's a challenge in some communities. Quite a challenge actually in a number of communities. How you balance that, I think it's very challenging even for a researcher.
Great. Well, I have to say we are at time, and there were 48 questions in the 46 questions in the chat. So, we can't get through all of them. I've just been reading through some of them, some really, really good ones, and some really just thoughtful comments, which I think have been great. So please, scroll through them. But I'm going to sort of just wind up now quickly. And, one of the reasons why we did this webinar was really to kind of just showcase this booklet that we did, How to Write About Africa, an Ethical Storytelling Handbook, with 8 very simple steps. So I'm going to tell you what those 8 steps are. So if nothing else, you have got 8 steps that you can quickly go home and practice now, and then you're an ethical storyteller. First one is to own your privilege. The second one is to be respectful. The third one is to co-create the content. The fourth one is to check your bias. The fifth one is for consent, to make sure you get it. The sixth one is to understand the local context. The seventh is to put in the time, make sure you have time. And the eighth one is to empower your people, as in the people who are actually gathering the stories for you. So that's it. That's all we have time for. So I'm going to just thank my panelists, because I really enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was very insightful and very thoughtful. And like you say, it was nothing like a lecture. So thank you. So thank you to Professor Lebu, to Dimuna Piri, to Heba Ali, to Emily Renshaw-Smith. Appreciate your time. I want to say thank you to everyone who joined, because we know that your time is valuable. And because of COVID, there's been so many webinars. So I'm glad you made the time to join this one. So don't forget to please download the handbook. The link is in the chat. And of course, I have to thank Africa No Filter's funders, because without them, we wouldn't be able to do any of the work we do. So here's to Ford Foundation, to Bloomberg, to the Mellon Foundation, to Luminate, to the Open Society Foundation, to Comic Relief. I didn't mention Comic Relief were one of our funders, to British Council, the Hilton Foundation, and Facebook and Skull Foundation. We have a lot of funders. So thank you, everybody. And yeah, we will be in touch again with our next webinar, but we really appreciate everybody joining this one. Goodbye.